Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Kathleen and I are both incredibly excited and grateful to have you all here sharing your expertise with us on this really important conversation around museum education and the important work that you're doing for your communities, using the museum space, using the museum objects and collections to tackle difficult topics and to deal with trauma. So I want to welcome all of you, just give you brief introductions, and then we're going to dive into some content for our conversation today. So welcome to Damon Reaves, who's Interim Senior Curator of Education and Public Programs at the Philadelphia Museum of Arts, to Kijo Lee, who's Director of Academic Affairs and Associate Curator of Special Projects at the Cleveland Museum of Art, to Gabriela Martinez, who is Director of Education at the Museum of Latin American Arts, and to Dalila Scruggs, who is Senior Museum Instructor and Coordinator of the Museum Education Fellowship Program at the Brooklyn Museum. So thank you all. You all are coming from such wonderful institutions with such interesting experiences, programs, and collections, and I'm excited for our conversation today. So I'm just going to dive in. And what I really want us to talk about first is how you're all thinking about teaching difficult content in the museum space. And I know it's kind of interesting to frame it that way while we're all virtual and in this Zoom environment, but both in the physical museum space and in the virtual museum space. So histories of violence and oppression can be deeply connected with trauma. Can you tell us more about the ways that you're all acknowledging trauma in your practice? Do you create spaces, for example, through your public programs or through collaborations with professionals in the field, in community conversations, or even in ways that you might be teaching around specific gallery objects or buildings or physical spaces for your communities to really start tackling this difficult content? I'd love to invite Dalila to maybe kick off our conversation.
I'm really thrilled to be able to answer this question. I started a program in direct response to the COVID pandemic. We really came up with the idea in April, right? We were all sent home in March. And then around April, we began thinking about how we could support our communities to get through this difficult time. We didn't know we'd still be doing this a year later. And so for me, I do see trauma, like personal trauma, connected with the larger systemic issues of racism and oppression. But the program is called Art and Empathy, Community Care Through Art. And we were really thinking specifically about COVID. But of course, we know that those COVID has connected and highlighted the ways that systemic oppression works. And what I felt like was I started just with even my own experience of just being more isolated and lonely, but obviously also thinking about the ways that the disease has disproportionately affected people of color. And I was really inspired by the Philadelphia African American Museum. They did a program in the early days where they explored the effects of COVID, and they had a religious practitioner alongside science researchers talking about that. And I just found it so moving the way that they ended with these dedications to ancestors and people who had passed away during COVID. At the same time, I realized that I was very ill prepared to open up a conversation and ask people to remember their deceased, and facilitate it over Zoom. That was not something that was anywhere in my wheelhouse. And particularly through talking about it with my manager, the director of education, and a couple other stakeholders in the institution, realized that it would be irresponsible to open up something where trauma could be exposed to the public and not have a way of handling it. In fact, I was dissuaded from doing anything that could be triggering. And I agree that we don't want to invite people to get triggered on a Zoom call, hang up, and then we never hear from them again. And so the program, because of that specific need and that array of potential things that could go wrong, the program design came out of wanting to create connections, create community, at the same time as hold space and really navigate really carefully around potential traumas that could emerge. So one of the things we did right away is I connected with an art therapist, and then also reached out to Silberman School of Social Work. And in my initial conversations with both the school and also the art therapist, really beginning to think about what it means to do community care and the real clear distinction we need to make between something that can be therapeutic versus something that is actually therapy, so that we are not crossing any lines.
First, let me just say that I think this program is really interesting. I think it's incredibly also responsible. What strikes me is just how carefully you were thinking about the needs of your community, not just in providing that space, but also making sure that you were providing the most responsible space, like supporting people so that they weren't potentially re-traumatized and then not supported in that. I'll just share that I had arranged a field trip to the Met to see the Delacroix show with some students, and I had a student who was like viscerally affected by a painting and in live, and I've done museum education for a while, and I was like, I don't know what to do like in this space. And so I think that this is something that I would love for us to talk about, right? So you're working in partnership with someone who has that expertise. But many of us have led programs, are leading programs, or leading conversations, right, around topics that are generally challenging, or around objects that when you confront the objects might elicit some kind of response. And so I'm wondering if Kijo, Damon, or Gabriela might like to jump in with some other experiences, either programs or conversations around objects where they've thought through this idea of like, what do I do with this challenging topic?
Well, first of all, I just want to acknowledge that, I mean, even the question of like challenging topics is very challenging in itself,
Yes.
right? So it's who is it challenging for? Things that you might feel are very easy are very challenging for someone else, or something that might be challenging for you as an educator is actually quite simple for the people who are receiving it. And I think sometimes we can sort of over project in terms of how, instead of actually asking the question of how people are receiving something, we can kind of over project over what their feelings might be, or what their reaction is. And maybe just sort of as a case in point, when you sort of catch yourself in a very difficult moment. This is in my early days in gallery teaching. I remember we had a show of watercolors by Jerry Pinkney. So it was just kind of looking at his illustrations, and I can't remember the exact book, but it dealt with, stories of like childhood in the segregated South. And there was this illustration of separate water fountains, whites only, colored only water fountains. And I don't believe it was, this was a couple years ago. So I don't believe it was on the tour per se, or was a particular object that we stopped in front of. It was a relatively mixed group of young ladies. I would say like second, third grade, from mixed ethnic and racial backgrounds, who asked the question of why were those signs there, and asked what was going on. And I just sort of think about like those moments that I had where I remember sort of like looking at the painting, looking at the students, looking at the teachers, and kind of making eye contact with the adults in the room and being like, I'm going to go here, and I need, it was all unspoken, but it was kind of, I'm going to go here and I need you to stop me if this goes someplace that you as the grown-ups are uncomfortable with. And kept a pretty high level, but we had a relatively intense conversation with very young people about segregation that did result in a lot of questions about why would you do that, and why would people ever think that that's okay. And I think what was powerful in the moment was not pushing anyone on where we needed to go with the conversation, sort of letting them take the cues. They asked the questions, and where I could respond, I did. And I did not pretend that I had answers that I didn't. We kept referring back to the work. There's a little bit of safety in these children's book illustrations that we could keep coming back to. But we also let space be for their very difficult reactions to it. So, it didn't go to the place of no one was crying. I wouldn't say that we triggered anything, but we allowed that space for someone to be confused. And we sort of sat with that confusion for a while. And that was a very powerful moment for me to say, what does it mean to sit with that confusion and let silence be, let the questioning be, and not have to have all of those answers, but let that space generate itself.
First, thank you both for those really careful responses to the question. And I think that my response maybe links both of those. So in my role, I'm often called upon to lead what are called close looking sessions, and they can be for a variety of audiences. It's been anyone from and primarily I deal with university audiences, so undergraduate students, graduates, researchers. We have special close looking programs for the medical community. But I remember early on in my role at the Cleveland Museum, I was asked to lead a close looking session inside of a focus show on new acquisitions. And the two pieces that were hanging right next to each other was a piece called Alabama 1960 by the abstract expressionist Norman Lewis, hanging next to a photograph by Louis Draper called Congressional Gathering. And it's sheets on a line, but it also looks like a line of Klan members. So, you know, I consider myself, I love to talk about these sticky topics. So when I'm thinking about trauma, I'm often working through my own understandings of racial trauma in the US. I can recall in the first class I ever took on race and representation in American art, going home and weeping because it hadn't occurred to me how deep and how long the ideas about Black inferiority had, how deep it permeated the visual record. So maybe I shouldn't have been shocked, but I was. So at any rate, I'm standing in front of an ostensibly all white, older audience of about 45 people. So I'm surrounded really to talk about these things. And the way that I typically open these conversations is to acknowledge my own privilege and the ways in which who I am as a person dictated why I selected these objects to talk about. I'm very upfront about why I'm putting these things together. And I'm also upfront about the ways in which I am a Black person standing in front of a white audience, and that the very things that brought me into art history as a field are the things that keep people that look like me out. So that's what we're sitting with, sort of in that space. And I allow people a moment to look and think before they respond. And I also am sure to sort of set the stage such that we are recognizing in each other, not humanity, because I feel like that's so, I'm very over the idea that I need to establish a baseline humanity for myself in the face of anyone. So I think that it's more about establishing the notion that we are a set of experiences meeting another set of experiences, and that work of art is another body that we're encountering, and we're going to respect all of ourselves in this moment. And that means watching what you say, I will watch what I say. So I think that in some ways it's really laying down those stakes fairly early. And I tend to do it with humor. So I'm pretty bald about what I present, but it's usually wrapped in some, I'm not self-deprecating, but some way of letting folks know that we're going to make mistakes in this conversation, and that's fine. And I think that in some ways that's allows people's insecurities to be set aside so that we're not necessarily triggering, right, that defense. And I think that the one thing about being in a gallery with people that does get lost online is I can read people's body language. I can see when someone's stiffening up. I can see when someone has something that they really want to say, but they aren't saying. I can see when folks are coming with me and when they're not. Yeah, so I'll leave that there. Just thinking about how part of dealing with trauma is how I comport myself to deal with my own, but also to be able to hold a place for other people's defenses and issues as they arise, even if it's just waiting a beat, a full 60 seconds before pressing pressing into another question.
Gabriela, I was wondering if any of this resonates with the kind of maybe gallery teaching or any of the programs that you're offering. Your collection is different from the collections that we're talking about here, but so rich and so incredibly important. So I just wanted to invite you to jump in and reflect a little bit.
I guess one of the nice things about really talking about Latin American and Latinx art is that there isn't a lot of exposure to the objects really within the general population. And so the majority of my work really comes in contextualizing the artworks that are made. And so there is an expectation that we will be dealing with topics of colonialism and topics of migration, talking about not fitting in, talking about, different aspects of history. And so what my main job is really identifying the communities and the experts out there who can really give more information about these historical events or sort of the cultural traditions around them. So I think people come into the museum just really expecting, I think they come in two ways, either expecting like a celebration of culture or like a confrontation of this historical past. So what has worked for me is just really identifying those communities, whether we're talking about people who have lived through, dictatorships, or people who have come here as undocumented migrants, and really letting them take the lead in creating or developing the programs around these different objects. And because people do come to the museum kind of expecting to learn more about Latin American art and history, I think they come a little more open-minded and expecting to be confronted with these issues.
So your comments also making me think a little bit about audience and audience responses. And so I'm wondering too, if you might share with us maybe some of the responses that you've received from museum patrons. I know, depending on if you're thinking about programs that might have a kind of like reoccurring seriality to them, when you start to, I like to think of them as frequent flyers, people who tend to come to these programs often, right? If you're getting feedback or any kind of feedback that you've received from people who might have been impacted from these experiences.
My team, the art therapist Sarah Pusti and my social work intern Lula Zaray and I picked Latoya Ruby Frazier's work, Grandma Ruby and Me, for our second Art and Empathy program. And I love Latoya Ruby Frazier's work. I love how she connects the personal to the systemic. And, I had, just in my art historical brain, I had understood, I understand her process. I understand her connection to her family, found this great Art 21 video. But I hadn't, and I understood that, her grandmother had passed away intellectually. But it wasn't until just the beautiful process that I know all of you know about, when you stand in front of a work of art, or when you're looking at a work of art and you unpack it and it just grows and grows and it becomes more beautiful. I didn't really calculate for the way that doing that process and spending so much time understanding Grandma Ruby through this picture would then play out when we watched the Art 21 video, and then everybody, all 150 of us in the Zoom room, discovered she had passed away. And I mean, and there were a couple of things that prevented me from prefacing the video as much as I had hoped. So that was a mistake, I guess, or just, I would have liked to do it differently. But a number of things around trauma and audience response emerged from this, rather than people, we ended up having a number of people who shared about their grandmother, a number of people who did cry. I mean, I got teared up, and I had obviously watched the video a couple of times to prepare for the lesson, but it just hit different, to put it, colloquially. But what happened, and what one of the program goals is, it's community care, right? There's this great article that says, like, nowhere else in the medical field would you say, hey, go by yourself and deal with and heal yourself on your own, right? The fact that we were all in this room, and there were a couple of ways that we try to engender community, but what happened was people shared, one woman put in the chat, I'm sorry for your, she said, somebody shared out loud, my grandmother passed just recently, a couple months ago, and somebody else said, I'm sorry for your loss. And then when we did the feedback evaluations at the end of the program, that was one of the things that stood out. And we learned that more than talking, obviously people want to talk about art, but what people are coming for is that opportunity to connect. I have a one here that was like, I love the opportunity, the prompt to interact with our objects in our space. Connecting to nostalgic objects was really comforting, but also they also mentioned the kind-hearted people in the group. That was a pretty frequent response, was I liked hearing from different perspectives. I liked being able to talk to other people. And we've done this a couple of months now, and the number one demand is more time in small breakout rooms so that we can talk with other people. So that's been the number one response. But speaking of trauma, that was a really difficult learning experience for us to figure out how we could be a little bit, be cognizant of how we put people in a situation to connect publicly over something that could be so vulnerable.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that experience. And it makes me think of something that I'd love for us to build upon in a later part of our conversation, which is thinking about museums like as the space of healing, how communal looking and communal discussion can also be kind of leveraged, right, to help address trauma in ways that are productive, supportive, and an act of care. And it's really inspiring to hear how this all transpired and how cathartic it was, but also supportive and positive it ended up being. So it's a really beautiful experience. So thank you for sharing that. And I think, you know, some themes that are coming up out of all of these different experiences is, you know, creating a safe space. It's a loaded term, but like, you know, making sure that there's a degree of safety, holding space for people's authentic and deeply personal responses to things, even if you can't anticipate those, right? And then also being a little bit vulnerable. I think that particularly this was my experience as a museum educator, there's a degree of vulnerability that has to happen because, you know, there's not an exam at the end of this. There's, you know, we could talk about goals and learning goals and objectives for lessons and programs, and we do, but they resonate a little bit differently in the museum space, and that there's not these like assessments, these formal assessments at the end of the lessons. I wanted to invite anybody to comment on ways that you might think about maybe some like, maybe let's switch to something a little bit more granular, like ways that you might prepare, like are there goals for programs where you're addressing this kind of content? Are there specific strategies that you might employ? If anybody has any thoughts around that, I'd welcome you to share.
I think in like hosting programs, for me particularly, it's important to be very clear about who I am and where I'm coming from, and be very open about my own identity, you know, and where I stand, where, you know, how I came into the museum, and my opinions about the topic that we, you know, I try not to make myself seem, I guess, objective, because I don't believe that that exists. And so I think in introducing the topic or in, you know, giving my response, I'm just very honest about who I am. That's my strategy.
Maybe, I mean, I think I love that we're using the word facilitation, because I don't know how I still don't know if I think of myself as like a teacher. I don't know exactly. I hold teachers in a very high regard. Maybe I will always sort of have this kind of crazy separation where it's like I'm never going to be able to reach that plateau or something. But I love this word facilitation. You know, and I spent some time when I was younger getting some training as a peer mediator, and I think about how that serves me so well in so many conversations, because I think about facilitators as like you're kind of helping move things back and forth, right? Like the conversation, the power is really in other spaces, and you're just sort of your traffic cop. You're kind of helping flow go into different spaces. So we did a program. I helped sort of launch a program. I'm a museum, which I haven't done in a while, called Community Conversations. And this kind of came from the fact that there was, to get specific, we were doing a show of Velisco fabric. So it was this sort of complicated notion of, it was really a process sort of oriented exhibition. That's what they were talking about, the wax resist dye and yada, yada. But, you know, this relationship between, is this or is this not African fabrics because of Dutch colonialism and the history and yada, yada. And it wasn't really covered in the didactics, but we knew we wanted to hold space for that conversation. And what was interesting was to have a mix of people come to that space to chat about it, to talk about this idea without anyone sort of claiming a solid position of authority. You know, authority came from a lot of different spaces in that. And we, you know, there was an opinion that came from people whose ancestors or people who are first generation American from Ghana, who had one very particular interaction with these works, and we're like, absolutely, this is African fabrics. Why is this even a discussion? This is, we name the fabrics, we own the fabrics, and you know, and obviously I'm here not trying to get into that debate, but what I thought was so powerful was how all these different perspectives came to the discussion, and we made space for them. Again, back to this idea of holding space and how you allow that sort of conversation. And you know, Keisha, what you were sort of talking about, sort of seeing body language became so important in those conversations, to see sort of how people were responding when someone might be getting uncomfortable, how you can sort of go further to unpack, or maybe you need to set something aside for a little bit. But that idea of shared authority as a strategy, I think becomes very important to me. And Gabriela, I think that goes back to maybe how I'm interpreting what you said about sort of being honest about your position and your identity coming into a conversation. Is that I always think of myself as like, I'm one of the elements of this conversation, and I have a certain knowledge and skill set to bring to it, but so does everyone else that's in that room, you know, and sometimes they're a little bit more interested in mine and sometimes they're not. But I gravitate towards those programs that allow for that kind of free flow.
I love that. I want to say it's my philosophy in my classroom teaching too, Damon. So I think that kind of like sage on the stage model is not one that I feel super confident about, or I love this idea of being among equals and exchanging ideas and kind of growing and learning together. And I don't know if that came out of being a museum educator and then returning back to teaching and in higher ed situations, but I really appreciate the way you're framing this.
I think that what Damon and you have been talking about also connects with what I've most recently been learning about trauma-informed teaching as well. So there's so many connections between giving other people autonomy in social work. It's like the principle of self-determination. And also from a trauma-informed perspective, the idea of everybody has a choice. And so saying there's no right or wrong answer, we are sharing this really is about giving people that chance to shape their discussion. And so I just love the way that museum education practices like facilitating conversations that are open-ended connect so well, already dovetail with what's just good practice from a trauma-informed perspective.
I completely agree. Thank you. I just wanted to ask a slightly different question, thinking about museums just more broadly. So not necessarily your individual institutions, but just in general, thinking about, and I take Damon's point from earlier to heart that like we shouldn't just have like one monolithic definition of what difficult content is, and that means something different to many people. But if we think about the objects in the collections that are engaging, you know, with histories of violence, with histories of oppression, with histories tied to violence towards female bodies, systemic racism, and so on and so on and so on, you know, what responsibility do you think museums have in directly addressing this?
Well, I mean, I think that I'll use a specific program as an example, even though it's not really about what my institution thinks is their role. It's more about what I think my role inside of an institution, the role like I have. The Cleveland Museum sits in the center of a vast medical campus. So we have the Cleveland Clinic, university hospitals, the VA hospital. I mean, a multitude of medical humanities programs. There's a medical history museum on Case Western Reserve's campus called the District. And so we've had a program for, I want to say the last decade. It was formerly called Vital Signs. And when I arrived, we renamed it Art and Insight. And it is for the medical community. And it's a variety of close looking programming that we do specifically for medical students. For instance, I do, except, you know, we've been interrupted by the Rona, but I typically run a class both on site and in their lecture hall for 180 plus first year medical students for the clinic, this kind of thing. So in 2019, Cleveland declared racism a public health crisis. And Cleveland has some of the worst statistics in the country for the outcomes for Black women, whether it's health, education, or income. And so, and it's also the case that I think in 2015, they did a survey of medical students, which said that up to 50% of them still believe that Black folks feel pain differently, have a different musculature. It's the case that pulmonary machines are still calibrated as though African Americans have a different lung capacity, when we know that that has been debunked, but the machines are still calibrated as such. So it feels incumbent upon me to sort of intervene through art, which is a practice that I started doing and learned to do in the gallery teaching program that I did at Yale, but developed with Cleveland's collection. So essentially, I work through a work by a Cleveland artist named Charles Saleh called Bedtime. And it's a Black woman whose back is turned to the viewer. She's standing in front of a mirror, but you can't see her reflection at all. And I utilize that work to talk about what the sort of generational response of traumatic response to medical advice that may exist, that those students may have no idea about when they're just looking at this woman sitting in front of them, and to think about what it would feel like to generationally never have a space in which you were not surveilled, where your body is utterly and completely your own, and now you're being asked to disrobe and believe someone that you don't know, as they are making recommendations to you that may feel uncomfortable. And for me, it is about them returning to that place to work through whatever thoughts and issues they may have, and whatever comes up or may come up around this topic, rather than in and through the human person that they are contending with in their office. So for me, it's also about setting up a repeated, I am always telling them, it's like a muscle memory. I do this over and over again. It is a way of, again, comporting oneself. So I think that's really sort of the overarching thing. I think I try to facilitate how people can think about their ways of being in front of a work of art, and asking themselves not what can this thing tell me, but what is it asking of me. So those are sort of the ways that I think at museums we can frame the artworks as making demands and asking questions of their viewers. And then those will be my last point. Sarah Lewis, in her editor's note in the Vision and Justice Aperture Special Edition from a few years ago, said that it is incumbent upon the American citizenry to almost become art historians in their ability to read images. And I think that if we've learned nothing else in the last set of years, is we have to become really attuned to what we are seeing, because the idea that you should not believe your lying eyes is incredibly just so prevalent. And so how do we increase that literacy, not in a way that's prescribed, but just questioning what you are receiving and thinking about where the evidence is? How do you prove that in the paint? And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Kijo. I couldn't agree more or say it any better. So thank you. And I think this is a good place to maybe end our conversation for this part. And I think it really sets us up nicely to continue this conversation and thinking about audiences and community.